Our next talker is Garth Global from La Conza H. San Sebastian in Spain, and he's going to be talking about global issues. So over to you, Garth. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Well, hello everybody, and as you've just heard, welcome to this talk on global issues. I think perhaps one of the first things that we need to look at, and apologies if everybody's thinking, well, I know this, is what exactly are global issues, or certainly within the context of what we do as teachers, what can we consider global issues to be? Perhaps one of the things that would spring to most people's minds, I'm sure many of you have done lessons on this, is something connected to the environment, for example, pollution, the effect of global warming, which of course are all relevant topics to our learners, but I think what we need to consider is perhaps how many times our learners have done these kind of lessons, and perhaps try and widen the scope of our focus on global issues. This will be one of the things that I will be looking at during this talk. I'll also be directing you to some resources with ready-made lessons, not mine, I hasten to add, but hopefully you'll find them very, very useful, and I will be showing you some brief examples of those lessons. But yes, as I say, global issues, obviously we could think about poverty, we could think about racism, women's rights, women's issues in general, and perhaps one thing that will be interesting to some of you to perhaps use with some of your learners is the issue of women and clothing, which has been something that's been quite prevalent in the news in the UK. I recently did a lesson, some of you may be aware of a female shop worker being told that she had to wear high heels to work, refusing to do so, and this then caused quite a controversy. At the time I was teaching a proficiency exam class, a Cambridge Proficiency, and simply using newspaper articles and adapting them slightly, and then of course creating activities to go with it, I created a lesson around this issue of whether or not women should be forced to wear a particular type of dress during their working life. My experience was that this was particularly of interest not only to the women in the class, but to every single member of the class. And I think that is an indication of how global issues, for want of a better term, it's a very wide term obviously, is something that our learners do want to speak about. What I'm going to show you next, this is a quote. Now, okay, it was taken from 1998. It was from some research conducted by Mori, and it's taken from the book Global Issues by San Pedro and Hilliard, and that is again a resource that I'll be directing you to at the end of the talk. Although it was done in 1998, and as you can see it says that research among 11 to 16-year-olds indicates that over 80% are interested in global issues and feel they should learn about them at school. My feeling, and this is from experience as well as opinion, this can only have increased. And perhaps one pointer that we could look at to prove this is the case is obviously the advent and the spreading of the use of social media. And I think we see more and more nowadays that younger people who perhaps we might not readily assume would want global issues addressed in their lessons are very, very interested in talking about these things because they do affect them and they affect their daily lives. I'm going to move on now to link this hopefully to how this affects us as language teachers. And I've just mentioned the book Global Issues by San Pedro and Hilliard. And I've taken another quote from that book, so I'm very grateful to them for their work and for the purpose of our talk today. So as you can see, they say the primary aim of language teaching is to communicate with people from other cultures. Now, I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that as teachers, that is, of course, primarily what we're working on. We're working to help our learners communicate in a language that is, of course, not their first. Whether we like it or not, and I would imagine as language teachers we probably do like it, English is one of the main international languages of communication. As you can see, the quote goes on to say, it's a natural extension of this to challenge cultural and racial stereotypes, promote tolerance, and work to reduce conflict and inequality. I would hope that we will be hard-pressed to find anybody who would disagree with the fact that those particular objectives are ones that we should all strive to try to achieve, not only by our work as teachers in the classroom, but in the world in general and in our lives in general. But obviously what we're focusing on is how we can promote this within the classroom. I should perhaps say at this point that I'm by no means saying that we should push our opinions on to our learners. Some of you, and I should really say like myself, will perhaps have very long held and perhaps very strong political views. I do not in any way think that it is our job as a teacher to push those views onto our learners. And I think any kind of lengthy polemic from the front of the classroom, from the teacher, is simply teacher-centered. And as a teacher trainer for many, many years, I've been telling trainees and in-service teachers over that time, remember that you are not the focus of the lesson. It's not about you using the language. As teachers, we can use the language. We're trying to pass on that knowledge and that ability to our learners. So although I think that the aim of language teaching is to promote communication, within the context of global issues, I do not think it should be or is the teacher's job to tell our students what to think. What we should actually be doing is creating critical thinking or encouraging critical thinking as far as our learners are concerned. Now, I'm going to move on to this next point. What are the advantages and disadvantages of integrating global issues into language learning programs? I'll be completely honest, you've probably gathered by now, I think the advantages hugely outweigh the disadvantages. But I'm going to start to look at the disadvantages, and I have, to a certain extent, touched on them already. And I think one of the main disadvantages is if a teacher, no matter how well-meaning, starts to insist that this is the way that his or her learners should think. This is my opinion on global warming, and it should be yours. And I have observed lessons, thankfully occasionally, where that has been to a certain extent the teacher's focus, and you can see his or her opinion almost being pushed onto the learners and words being put into their mouths, or opinions that the teacher doesn't like perhaps not being praised in the way that the ones that he or she does like are receiving that praise. And I think this is something that's very important and that we need to make sure that this doesn't happen. What are the advantages? Well, I think the advantages are huge. I mean, let's link it specifically to the job that we do and some of the courses that I think many of you will have taught over your teaching careers. So let's just look at the main Cambridge suite of examinations. Many global issues are used not only as topics in course books that prepare our learners for these particular types of exams, but also in the exams themselves. So therefore, I think that is a very practical activity or a practical reason and advantage of using global issues in language learning programs. If we step outside of perhaps the constraints of a Cambridge exam course, I think it's important that our learners are able to use the language that they are learning to protest, to criticize, to think critically and to challenge ideas that they are being given in the language that they are learning. I'm sure many of you, particularly teachers who are based in the UK, for example, will be well aware that government funding for teaching English to speakers of other languages has been cut quite drastically over recent years. And only a couple of years ago, a group of students decided to actually tweet their messages in protest about these cuts to the Department of Business, Innovation and Skills in the UK. And these were passed on by a campaign group to the then London Mayor Boris Johnson. This was an example, I think, and I don't want to look at it politically, but this was an example of a group of English language students wanting to use English to put across their point of view. And I would suggest that any teacher who doesn't actually want to provide them with that language, not to tell them what to think, but to provide them with the language to express their views and their opinions. A teacher who refuses to do that, I think to a certain extent, is not meeting their learners' needs, and that's obviously part and parcel of our job. What kind of thinking can teaching with global issues encourage? Well, as I've said, I think essentially it encourages critical thinking. It allows our students to do what I'm sure many of them do in their first language, which is if they hear a news report in their first language or they read a newspaper article in their first language. They don't simply accept what they're reading or what they're being told. They approach it critically. And I think it's our job to help them to do that in what is a second or a foreign language. Okay. I'm now going to move on. Excuse me for 1 second, everybody. I'd like to look at some points made by Alan Malley in his foreword to the same book, Global Issues, by San Pedro and Hilliard, that I've already referred to. And again, this is to try and give you some ideas that, well, okay, this is why we should be looking at integrating global issues into our language learning programs. I'm sure that many of you do this already, and the schools where you work at do this already. But he says that language teaching has no defined content, but global issues provide ready-made content. And I would absolutely agree with this, and I think not only do global issues provide ready-made content, but they provide ready-made content that is relevant to the lives of our learners. He goes on to say that the content is not trivial, which is the case with many course books. Now, as a teacher trainer, I've often heard trainee teachers and in-service teachers criticize the content of course books. My opinion generally is that the course books that are available to us nowadays are generally a very high quality. But you may or may not agree that at times the content can be trivial. And that is, of course, not the case as far as global issues are concerned. And I think we can probably all agree that it's anything but trivial. He then says that global issues have personal relevance for the lives of language learners. And again, this is something that I've touched on, but I'd like to give you a little bit more of my experience on this and how this very much is the case. I've been lucky enough to do some in-service training with English language teachers in Cuba. And I've also done presentations to students in Cuba doing teacher training degrees. And as you may or may not know, Cuba is subject to an embargo or blockade, depending on which word you want to choose, from the US, and has been for many years. And in fact, those teachers told me that their students want to be able to talk about this in English. They want to be able to talk about people that they meet, for example, tourists who visit their country, about what they feel the effects are of the embargo on the education system and how it prevents them from learning as effectively as they could with, for example, the shortage of course books due to the situation. Now, once again, I'm not encouraging anybody, particularly us as teachers, to give a particular opinion on this, but I think it is a good example from my own teacher training experience of how global issues have personal relevance for the lives of language learners. These teachers saw this relevance in the example I've given and wanted to be able to provide the opportunity to their learners to talk about it. If we go on to look at another point that he makes, now perhaps this is a little bit contentious, I did want to include it. As you can see, the English language as the principal vehicle of global consumerism should bear some responsibility for making consumers of English aware of some of its less desirable effects. Excuse me. Now, I did actually include this particular quote in an in-service teacher training session I did here at International House in La Junta in San Sebastián in Spain, and some people found this going a little bit too far. The point, obviously, that I think was being made in the foreword to global issues is that English is the international language of global consumerism, and with globalization this has become more evident, I think, really. So therefore, surely when our learners are being exposed to English being used to sell products, to encourage them to consume products, sometimes you could argue, disregarding the effect of that consumption, perhaps we can balance things by giving our learners power within the use of the English language to offer an alternative opinion. And perhaps to say, well, maybe this is not the best thing. Maybe global consumerism is having a negative effect. And I think, again, as I've already touched on, it's all about giving our learners the language to be able to do this, not telling them what to say or what to think. Now, as I promised earlier in the talk, I will be looking at some specific materials from one of the websites that you're also going to get towards the end of this talk. And I'm also going to be looking at the more practical side, perhaps, of actually preparing and delivering lessons on global issues. So, at this point, I'm just going to bring this part of the talk to some kind of conclusion. So, first of all, what I would say is this. We're preparing our learners to use English in the real world, and global issues affect all of us on a daily basis. Some people have argued in sessions that I've done like this in the past, and I have done a number of sessions on this, both in the UK and, as I've mentioned already, in other countries such as Cuba. And some people have said, yes, but this is really only for adult learners. I don't think younger learners will be interested in it. Now, I know I started the talk with a quote that said that, well, no, this isn't the case. And in my experience of teaching younger learners, teenagers, for example, excuse me, everybody, this isn't the case. And I think the more that we use real issues, not necessarily always global issues, but real life language examples, and perhaps move away from what can be occasionally the contrived situations that are created in course books, then the more we're preparing our students to walk out of the classroom and to use the language in a real way. Whether that be to talk about a global issue or talk about some other issue that is something that we would talk about in real communication and a real interaction with somebody in the real world. And I'm sure many of you, like myself, are not only teachers but are also language learners. And I know, speaking from a personal level just for a short period of time, as far as speaking Spanish is concerned, I get huge amounts of motivation from being able to have a conversation in Spanish with somebody outside in the real world and see how that interaction actually develops. And I think that is the case as much with global issues as it is with anything else. They affect us all on a daily basis, and I think any attempt to separate global issues and put it to one side and say, yes, but this is a little bit controversial, we shouldn't really talk about it, I don't think is really addressing what's happening in the real world. Many learners want to discuss global issues, and as I've touched on earlier, I would say that meeting their needs is an essential part of our job. Obviously, we need to think about what global issues we might or might not tackle in the classroom. And as a teacher trainer, I've always said to someone, maybe to give an example that perhaps won't seem that clear at first, but if you are deciding to use a song in the classroom for a listening activity, the last thing you should do, the very last thing you should do, is choose your favorite song. After all, what on earth has it got to do with what we like? It's what our learners like. And when I've been preparing lessons on global issues, one of the first things I've done is to find out what a new group of learners would like to talk about. So that has often been done by creating an actual real conversation within the class. And I'm saying, if we don't address needs, how can we validate the course itself, Shay is saying, and I would completely agree. We have to address their needs. And if your learners don't want to talk about pollution, for example, that doesn't have to be a global issue that you deal with. Ultimately, if you found with a class of learners, they don't want to discuss global issues at all for whatever reason, then despite, as you can probably see, being quite a strong advocate of teaching global issues, I would say, well, then don't teach global issues, because you could turn around and say to anybody that I asked that particular group of learners if it was something they were interested in. They said it wasn't, so therefore, fine, let's not talk about it. Jane's saying some of my students think that global issues are Italian politics and football. Well, fine, because once again, Jane, I would say that's the needs of that particular group of learners. And certainly, from my experience or knowledge, I would say perhaps those two things, Italian politics and football, are quite closely linked, actually. Okay, moving on, everybody. What makes a successful lesson? And I think this is obviously something that's quite important. So let's look at what I would say in my personal experience. I'm not trying to tell you that I have the answers to every kind of successful lesson with global issues, but in my personal experience, here is what makes a successful lesson, or certainly examples of what could make a successful lesson. So think carefully about the content and try to challenge your learners. Now, I've already used this example, so forgive me for referring to it again. But when I have had to cover, for example, the topic of pollution, IELTS courses, for example, then very often I've had sort of a few eyes being rolled, and we've talked about this before. So within the context of what you are teaching, and if you do have the freedom to essentially ask your learners what they want to learn as far as global issues are concerned, then try to do that and try to challenge them a little bit. But I do think it's important not to go too far, and perhaps depending on age, not to try to look at a global issue that perhaps is at that moment, and I stress at that moment, a little bit outside the general scope of your learners' understanding. Real life issues are better than global issues, is a comment that has just come in. Well, I would say that real life issues and global issues go hand in hand. They're intrinsically linked. Global issues are real life issues. Again, obviously that's something that could be discussed, so I'll leave that there if it's all right. Excuse me, everybody, I'm struggling with my throat today, which is perhaps not good timing, so 1 second. Okay. Remember that the primary aim is to teach language, and I know I've already said this, but I'm going to come back to it again. The primary aim is to teach language. That's obviously what our job is. I don't want to patronize anybody who's listening to this talk, and I think we need to maintain that as a focus. And again, I've said this, but I'm going to say it again, because I do think it's a danger, and I find that a lot of teachers who are very keen to teach global issues tend to have quite strong opinions on it. So don't lecture your learners. Your aim should be to encourage them to think critically. Liam is saying from Donegal in Ireland, is the challenge to introduce a global perspective to whatever issues the students feel are real to them? Yes, I would say it is. And, certainly within the world that we live in nowadays, perhaps to use somewhat of a cliche, it is important to introduce that global perspective. And perhaps by doing so, we can encourage not only critical thinking amongst our learners, but also wider understanding within a global perspective. Okay, everybody. Now, I did promise you that what I would do at some point is give you an idea, and obviously it's going to be a snapshot of what a global issues lesson could take. Now, before I go any further, the slide that you're looking at was not created by me. This is taken from a fantastic website that I will put up at the end of the talk. It's basically from New Internationalist, and it's a wiki. It's a fantastic resource. It has an easier English version, so it uses authentic materials, but also provides teachers with an easier English version of those authentic materials. It has lessons for every single level, from elementary up to advanced. There's teachers' guides on how to use the wiki, and at the moment there's more than 80 free, ready-to-go lessons. Now, the slide that you're looking at here, and many of the lessons are in PowerPoint format, is a lesson on women and clothing. This was actually aimed at the pre-intermediate and A2 class. And as you can see here, this is a discussion activity. The learners get 2 visuals, and what do you think about women covering their head? Are there any problems? We go on to see another slide. Now, this is a speaking role play. Now, I've sort of picked and chosen these slides, but these 2 women, the students, in the way that the lesson actually is staged, they would have had some background on their particular situation. So they will have been prepared for the speaking role play. And as you can see, it says, have a conversation about wearing a veil or the hijab. What is your story? How do you feel? And why? The name of the site is going to come up in about 6 minutes, Lucia. But I just wanted to show you it first, or show you examples of it first, rather than simply just referring to the site. One more slide here that you will see. So this is a pre-reading task, and I must say, as a teacher and a teacher trainer, I think these lesson resources have been so fantastically written. There's no reading activities where the learners are simply told to read without a task. The same with listening activities. There's many links where they can actually go to authentic resources to have a look at what they've been learning in the lesson. And as I say, I've had no input whatsoever on this site, so I'm not pushing it because I had some kind of involvement. But as you can see, before you read about them, what do you think these women think about wearing a veil? And you've got the three people or groups of people that I've just introduced you to. Okay, well, at this point, I think it is perhaps a good idea to bring in some of these resources. So the slides that I've just been showing you, the first link is there. So it's the eWiki New Internationalist website, as I say, a wide range of ready-made lessons. And I'm sure some of you might be thinking, well, what other issues do they cover, for example? And although you'll be able to look at it yourself, I'll just give you some ideas of what it covers. There's a fantastic lesson on countries, and it looks at countries where I must admit, when I first looked at the material, I wasn't even sure if you'd asked me anything else apart from the name and perhaps where the country was. As far as a world map is concerned, I wouldn't have known much more. Women's rights are dealt with. Charities and non-governmental organisations. I think very often course books will say, okay, charities are a good thing. Or perhaps people in general will say charities are a good thing, and certainly NGOs are. Well, that particular lesson looks at what the downside perhaps can be. Also, there's an excellent lesson on languages. Where'd your clothes come from Jane? That's a fantastic topic as well. And you know, when I used to work in London, there were a number of large chains, I won't mention the name, which were particularly cheap, and a lot of the students would say during a conversation in the class that they'd been there and they'd bought a t-shirt and it was extremely cheap and wasn't this great. And that was often used as a vehicle to ask the students to start to think critically and think, yeah, but why are those clothes so cheap? And how can they possibly be so cheap? And as you can probably imagine, that often led on to a discussion about how workers, often in developing countries, can be massively exploited in order for other people in other parts of the world to buy extremely cheap clothing. And again, I think that was an example of using real life issues to help our students to think critically and to use the language that they're learning, perhaps to question and to discuss further. Jane saying someone always pays somewhere with exploitation. Maybe I shouldn't do this, but I'm going to do it anyway, Jane. I couldn't agree more. It's not. I think perhaps linking back to the talk though, if a student actually said that in class, then I would, as much as possible, and I've managed so far, resist the temptation, which I haven't managed to resist now, by saying, yes, I completely agree with you. I would certainly, I mean, if the learner actually produced the type of language that Jane's just used in her particular comment, I would praise the language itself. And I am going to have to come back to the fact that I think it's really important that we try to do that as much as possible. You'll also see a link to the IATEFL Global Issues Special Interest Group, and they also have some fantastic lesson ideas there. I'm sure that some of you may already be part of that particular special interest group. They do some fantastic work, and as I say, if you go onto that particular site, you'll also see lessons and newsletter. It's updated regularly, and colleagues, other English teachers from all over the world are constantly adding lesson ideas based on their experiences of their own teaching contexts. And finally, I've referred to it a number of times throughout the talk, so I'm very grateful to it. I thought it was only fair, therefore, to have it as one of the resources. So Global Issues by Ricardo San Pedro and Susan Hilliard, which is an Oxford, an OUP resource book for teachers. And this is a fantastic resource. It does have a number of lesson ideas, again, for many, many levels, lots of different issues. As you can see, 2004, and I'm sure we all know that all teaching materials date very quickly, particularly nowadays, but it still has some fantastic ideas. I'm just about at the end of the talk, everybody, so I'd like to say thank you very, very much for listening and for your comments. And I hope that at the very least the talk has encouraged you, if you're not doing so already, to consider bringing global issues into the classroom. So thank you very much, and you're very, very welcome to those of you who are saying thank you. And it's been a pleasure speaking to you today, and good luck, everybody. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Garth. That was fabulous. And I'm sure everybody joins me in saying thank you. There's lots of thanks going on there. Great stuff. Really interesting links and sources as well. So thank you very much, Garth. Time to go straight into our